They've made it clear, the central banks and the government, that they want everybody to take a shot to the face. They want demand to go down. And I think that's already happening quite fast.
Demand for what?
Stuff. So if they put up your mortgage rates, you spend less in restaurants. If you're finding that your food bills at the supermarket 30% higher than they were, you spend less on something else. The price of goods moves either because there's not enough supply, which is what we've had a problem with, or it's because there's too much or not enough demand. So if you've got something with restricted supply, so let's think of oil right now. Because of the Russian situation, there is not enough oil for the current demand out there. So the oil price keeps going up. So you and I pay more to drive our cars or to heat or cool our houses. The only way of solving that one, because you can't get the Russian oil back into the market, is to make us use less oil. The price does that automatically because it gets more expensive, we do it. But if you can also then just lower general demand for things, we'll drive our cars less, we'll catch less flights, all of that stuff. And that lowers demand and therefore prices. Because prices rising, inflation, is evil for our savings because the dollar in your bank account is worth less in a year's time. It's currently worth 8% less, which is quite a lot. It's this weird situation where we have to take the pain. We're told we can't buy as much and we're forced into it by rising our mortgage costs and our food costs and all of this stuff. And eventually things will slow down, people will be put out of jobs a bit, and then the overall demand in the economy comes down and prices come down. We're all collectively taking the pain for this inflation that was created out of a whole bunch of different things, from the pandemic through to supply chain issues, through to underinvestment in commodities, through to the shift to green energy. All of these things have created this moment in time, which is tricky. So the Fed can engineer it by trying to raise interest rates and it filters through to our mortgages and other stuff. Or the market kind of clears of its own accord, where prices get too much, people stop buying stuff, prices fall back again. So either way tends to work, and we're in this weird mess where the Federal Reserve are doing it, the markets are doing it, and we're having to take all the pain in the meantime. I generally think that the market is better at doing it. If you actually see it, from my perspective, somebody who closely follows interest rate markets and stuff like that, they did all of the tightening anyway, well before the Fed. People you hear the expression, the Fed are behind the curve. What it means is the bond market's already priced it. Interest rates need to go up to slow down the economy because there's too much inflation, and the Federal Reserve are trying to catch up. I actually think the markets do a pretty decent job. Prices rise, eventually it gets too expensive, we stop doing it. Now, there's different equations that people fear is when it becomes super entrenched in the economy and we all go to our bosses and go, I want a pay rise, and everybody does that at the same time. That pushes up prices further, you get more wage rises, and that's a wage price spiral. That really has only happened in the US really once, which was in the late 70s, early 80s, when all of the baby boomers hit kind of 30 years old at the same time. So if you think when you go back to 30, you're kind of settling down with somebody, you're probably thinking about buying a house, you're buying a car, you've got a job, you're starting to earn some money. We had the largest group of people in all history turning 30 at the same time. And they all did the same thing and bought the same stuff, and that really pushed up prices. And that was at the same time there was issues with oil supply and other things. So we had this double whammy of a demand shock and a supply shock, which meant prices went crazy. But that's really only happened once. My view, and it still remains, even though it seems pretty unfashionable right now with inflation at 8.5%, as prices go up, the economy slows down. The exact mechanism, and therefore it becomes self-regulating. And it becomes that because people are quite in debt, and it's a very old population in the US and Europe and elsewhere. So if you raise prices on your retired parents, they can't earn more money because they've got their pension and that's it. So what happens is they end up buying less, and there's a big cohort of people. So that's why I think it automatically over time kind of self-corrects. But the other mechanism is the bond market, which is a fancy name for saying interest rates, the price that you and I and companies and governments can borrow. So if it becomes more expensive to borrow, so think of your mortgage, if you've got a mortgage, well then if it becomes more expensive to borrow, then you spend less. So the interest rate market forces demand to come lower. Now, let's say you don't have a mortgage and you're a renter. Well, the person you rent from has a mortgage, so they will raise your rent because of it, which is why everybody's feeling this pain now, feeling a bit poorer. And that's the issue that's here. However, they have one more other thing in their arsenal, and that is the balance sheet. Printing money or taking money out of the economy. And they have been printing money for a long time to offset the pandemic and the extra borrowing that was required, i.e. when they print money, they're buying the bonds of the government. So the Federal Reserve are buying the bonds of the government. So it allows the government to borrow more without causing any problems. Right now, they're about to start tightening, quantitative tightening. People hear the terminology. And what that basically is a fancy word for, we're going to take some money out of the economy. if they stop quantitative easing, which is the first step, which they've done, that's not putting any money in, extra money in. When they do quantitative tightening, they take money out. So if there's a big pool of money sitting there, and they say, listen, we're going to take 5% of that out every year, less money around, they sell the bonds that's on their balance sheet. So they have trillions of dollars of this stuff sitting around where they've stimulated the economy. And then what they do is push it back into the economy. And the idea is it pushes up wages, or all the banks have to buy these bonds now from the government. And so then they buy these bonds and they've got less money left to lend and do other activities with. It is weird, but if you break it down to the human element, I'm going to lend you money when I've got plenty of it. And if you're desperately in need of it, because you're going through hard times, you'll pay anything for it. And if you kind of would like to borrow some money but aren't desperate, you'll pay a lower rate. It's basically as simple as that. You know, the transaction between two people is the same thing. So if a mate of yours comes to you and you know they're a terrible creditor, but he's a friend, you're going to have to set an interest rate that maybe to make sure that you get compensated for the risk you're taking. And if you don't have much money because you're feeling a bit tight yourself, you're either not going to lend it to him or charge a bit more money because you could have used that money for something else. Leverage allows you to borrow future money to use now. So at two levels, humans are terrible. We just want everything now. We don't want to work for it. If I can borrow it and buy that Rolex watch or my new car, right? We're trying to meet our future expectations of ourselves always. That's what drives humans. So that's why they use leverage. And it's the same with investments. So they do it for purchasing power to bring that future expectations of themselves. Have I earned enough money to buy that car? No, but if I borrow money, I can get my future self here. It's kind of a trade-off because you're actually in debt and now owe somebody. You don't actually own the car. You own the ability to use the car until you pay that off. It's the same with a house, really. And the other point is for investments. You know, people love to borrow money now because then you can make a bigger investment now. But the trade-off is what happens if that goes wrong? Then before you know, you get a margin call or liquidated. And you know, that's a feature we see a lot in the crypto markets, for example. It happens kind of automatically. Humans just love this stuff because it brings their future expectations of themselves closer. I could be richer, I could have more stuff than I deserve now from my income. You can get in trouble if you can't pay your interest. So let's say the economy slows down and you lose your job. Now what seemed like a reasonable payment suddenly becomes impossible. And then you're in arrears, and then you get the little tap on your shoulder, which is like, I'd like that house back now. Because you don't own that house. We, the bank, do. This is what people don't understand with leverage. You don't own that thing. You only own it when you pay it off. So that's what happens when you lose your job, you then can't afford to pay your mortgage payments. Now, there's a difference between the US and Europe for this. So the US, you give the keys back to the bank. It's not the end of the world. In Europe, the debt stays with you.
Oh, God.
Yeah, it's very different.
They get the house back and you still owe the debt?
Correct, because the house is valued less, particularly when what you get, we refer to as negative equity. You buy a house for 300 grand and it's now worth 200 grand, you owe the bank 100 grand. Now, it's okay if you can still make the payments and eventually you just pay off the mortgage. But the moment you can't, they're like, well, you owe us 100 grand. And they take you to court and you carry that and you go to bankruptcy.
So we know we're going to take a kick to the face, but you've got the Baron Rothschild quote. So what everybody knows is buy when there's blood in the streets. But the original quote supposedly was buy when there's blood in the streets, even if the blood is your own.